Okay, so today we're going to be keeping on with period 8, and we're going to be getting into Kennedy's administration in terms of I don't want to necessarily say domestic agenda, mostly foreign policy we're going to talk about. We'll touch a little bit on his domestic policy when I get into other civil rights movement issues and stuff in a later video. Unfortunately for Kennedy, he was not president that long. So it's pretty easy to cover his domestic policy issues in one video and his foreign policy issues in another. So when Kennedy takes office, he calls this a new frontier. Now, if you know, we've seen that word frontier 100 times, right? We remember from Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier out west. We know frontier means like the edge of civilization. And so sort of what Kennedy meant when he was talking about a new frontier and how we recognize his administration as a new frontier is because this is sort of like an edge of like the dawning of a new era, so to speak. That's sort of the best way to put it. Not to be confused with the final frontier, which is outer space, which is also going to be pretty relevant during this time. So during this whole new frontier thing, a lot of things were going to be really important to Kennedy. One of which is we're going to see a massive military buildup across the board. Military spending all over the place is going to increase. That's definitely going to be something that's going to happen compared to previous presidencies. Kennedy talked about something called flexible response, which was essentially that he wanted the United States to be able to defend itself from any type of attack, whether it be, land-based, naval-based, a chemical attack, biological, whatever it was, we needed to be ready for it. So that meant in terms of our military, in terms of our weapon supply, in terms of our defensive strategies. So he's going to continue that arms race, and we're going to see where maybe a president or two before him have decreased the size of our military. We know Eisenhower, he shrunk the size of our standing army and just focused on sort of more bang for our buck, focused on like weapons buildup, but Kennedy is we're going to see a buildup from like every capacity, and we're definitely going to see military spending increase. In addition to that, he's going to continue to fund the space race. He's falling right in line with, previous administrations of trying to push for containment and beating the USSR at pretty much anything we can think of, and outer space definitely being one of those. So he's going to support NASA and all of our efforts to, get into space. And Kennedy made a promise. What he anticipated, most presidents when they are sworn into office, Kennedy was sworn into office in 1961. What he wanted was for at the end of his presidency to see a man on the moon. But unfortunately for Kennedy, he's not going to serve sort of the 8 terms that he had imagined. Not 8 terms, 8 years that he had imagined. He'll only serve about, he dies in November of 1963, so really about 2, or I guess you could say 3 years, which wasn't even, a full 1 term. So he's not going to live to see a man on the moon, and his administration won't. But at the end of the decade, in 1969, that will happen for us. So, which in theory, had he served 2 terms, it would have been in the end of the 1960s, right? He would have, his administration would have come to an end in 1968, 1969. So he sort of comes through on that promise, but it's not necessary. He doesn't necessarily get to take all of the credit for it. Furthermore, he's going to found the Peace Corps. If you haven't heard of the Peace Corps, they sort of do like service projects and things outside of the United States. It's sort of like a team that you can enlist in. It's very difficult to get into the Peace Corps. It's a very prestigious organization, very difficult to get into the Peace Corps. Most people now that enlist in the Peace Corps actually have college degrees. They've already completed some type of college program, but they would go into third world countries and underprivileged communities outside of the United States and serve in a variety of capacities, whether that meant building schools or, helping to set up power, or water treatment facilities, or power, or whatever it is that those communities needed. The Peace Corps was and is still an organization dedicated to sort of like expanding that goodwill outside of U.S. borders. Now, there are several moments in Kennedy's presidency and in his administration that we would consider to be hot spots during the Cold War. The first here is the Second Berlin Crisis. If you remember, the first Berlin Crisis was when Stalin closed all of the roads that led into West Berlin, and we had to do the Berlin airlift for over a year under President Truman in order to get them not only money but supplies and anything else that they would need. So that would be the first Berlin crisis. The second Berlin crisis is during Kennedy's administration. Now, if you remember, Stalin is gone. Now we're dealing with Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev wanted very badly to get his hands on West Berlin. It wasn't a good look for him, his administration, or communism for there to be a capitalist, essentially republic inside of a communist, totalitarian, like puppet government. It didn't reflect well on his leadership or the leadership that he had put in place in East Germany. And obviously, Kennedy's going to hold fast that that's never going to happen. You're never going to get your hands on West Berlin, so just give that up. But the two of them did agree to meet. So they met at a summit, and really there was not much of a point in meeting. It probably would have gone better had they not even met, because both of them go in, doubling down on exactly what they had planned on saying, which was, I want West Berlin. No, I want West Berlin. And were never able to come to any type of agreement because they both just like wanted what they wanted. And ultimately they end up arguing pretty intensely, kind of yelling at each other through interpreters. And ultimately Khrushchev ends up storming out. And Kennedy comes home, and in an effort to, I guess, send this message that the United States is like not one to mess with, he asks Congress to authorize another wave of military buildup. And if you're the Soviet Union, what message does that send? Obviously, it sends a message that the United States is preparing for war, clearly with the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev responds by one day, the rest of the world wakes up, and what do we find? But there's a giant wall all the way around West Berlin. And the Berlin Wall will remain there until 1989. And I mean, this wall was literally built, it wasn't necessarily like a full concrete structure overnight, but it was a wall constructed overnight. Parts of it were just fence and barbed wire for a while. Eventually, though, the entire thing would be a concrete structure. It's not super tall. I mean, it's definitely taller than a person. It's been a while since I've been there in person, but I mean, I don't know. If I was probably a person who is very determined could definitely climb it. But of course, it's going to be manned by Soviet guards along the perimeter, or every however many yards apart, they're gonna place guards all along the wall. And I mean, this went right through people's property lines, right through people's homes. I mean, there are people who's they had family on one side of the wall, or maybe their job was on the other side of the wall, and this is gonna make the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States much more strained, because now it's going to be a lot harder for the United States to conduct, and for West Berlin and West Germany to conduct their business within West Berlin now that it's so much more isolated. There will be checkpoints along the wall. The most famous checkpoint is in that photograph on the top right, which is called Checkpoint Charlie. It's still there, and you can get them to stamp your passport like it's the 1960s all over again. Obviously the stamps aren't real because Germany is now one unified country, but you can get them to stamp your passport now. But it was like passing through immigration and customs. It was not easy going from one side of Berlin to the other. And now with this massive wall, this literal structure to separate the two sides, it's going to be much harder. And there will be people who risk their lives trying to get across that wall. There are people who tried to climb it and were either killed or arrested by Soviet military. There were people who tried to drive a car through the wall to get to the other side because of how desperate a lot of times the situation was for East Berliners. Definitely not a good one. So in response to the creation and construction of the wall, Kennedy authorizes a deployment of 150,000 troops, additional troops, to West Berlin. So we're just stacking up a major military presence in Germany, trying to send the signal like, okay, yeah, you want to go to war in Germany? We're ready to go to war in Germany. So Kennedy's definitely trying to present this image like he's not one to be messed with and he's not going to be backing down in any of these situations. Now, aside from the Soviet Union and our worry about them, right before Kennedy took office in the 1950s, there was a communist revolution in Cuba led by the man with the cigar, Fidel Castro. Castro took power in Cuba, and this immediately freaks everyone out. Having a communist country so close to us. If you don't know, everyone should know where Cuba is just by being a human in North America. But if you don't know how close exactly, it's actually only 90 miles away from Cuba. We are only 90 miles. Florida is only 90 miles away from Cuba. You can swim that distance if you are so determined. Many people have done it. And so having a communist threat so close to us, not good, right? Because we want to contain it. This is definitely not containing it, and it's now spread so close to us. Additionally, what if they make a strong connection with the Soviet Union? Like, we definitely don't need the Soviets to have some spy or ally so geographically close to us. So when Kennedy runs for president, he makes this promise, like, I'm going to end Castro's reign. When I'm done being president, you're going to see that Castro is also no longer the dictator of Cuba. Unfortunately, spoiler, Castro is going to be in charge of Cuba for a long time. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Kennedy's lack of being able to get that done in the early years of his presidency, but nevertheless, his only real attempt at overthrowing Castro is an event called the Bay of Pigs. So right when Kennedy gets into office, they start working on this plan, which was to get together a bunch of these Cuban exiles, people who had been supporters of the old regime in Cuba, who had been pushed out when Castro took power, because had they stayed in Cuba, obviously they would have been executed as enemies of the state. So a lot of them claimed asylum in the United States. And so our plan is round up all the exiles, give them military training, and help them to plan an invasion back into Cuba, and we will help them overthrow Castro. That way, we don't have to send Americans in there to do it. We're just going to send Cubans in to retake their own land and get rid of this guy that we don't like. The whole thing goes down, and it's a total flop. All of the exiles just got arrested, and almost all of them were executed by Castro's regime. This makes Kennedy look like he, basically sent these guys off to slaughter, that he didn't prepare them well enough. And it also makes the United States look like the aggressor. Cuba actually hadn't done anything to us yet. This was all action out of fear. And now we look like the bully. We kind of were the bully. And so it makes sense that Cuba would then look to, hey, I need help. I need an ally on my side. And who, if you are freaked out by the United States and you happen to be a communist country, is going to be your best ally? Obviously, the Soviet Union, which is going to lead us to the hottest of all hotspots that we're going to experience during the entire Cold War, even up until the Soviet Union finally collapsed and the Russian Federation was established in the 90s. This will definitely be the closest that the United States will ever come to nuclear war in its history. So this was in the fall, in October of 1962. So we had gained, of course, it didn't take any time at all for Castro to become best friends with Khrushchev, and for the Soviet Union and the Cubans to begin a relationship. And so we, of course, are going to be monitoring what does that relationship look like. And President Kennedy will be given some satellite photos that look like that top left photo that you see there. That's not a satellite image. That's an aerial photograph that we took during a reconnaissance mission after we got the satellite images. But you can Google the satellite images. If you don't know how to really read a satellite image, you don't know what you're looking for, they're kind of hard to look at. It just looks like trees. It just looks like nothing. But what luckily our Department of Defense was able to figure out is that they were constructing missiles. And so Kennedy was like, okay, we need better images. And that's when we took these aerial shots here, not necessarily satellite images, but these were taken from an airplane. And when we analyze these photographs and this one up here at the top, what we begin to see is that not only is the Soviet Union constructing missile launching pads and equipment in Cuba, but some of these are nuclear weapons. They are putting nuclear weapons and missiles in Cuba, which is obviously not something that we want. Like I said before, Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. If the Cubans were to launch any type of nuclear weapons, this is the attack zone. We're all in it. We're all over it. I mean, we are the attack zone. So this is definitely something we want to avoid. However, if the United States institutes a blockade, now we've basically committed an act of war. It's not within our powers to blockade another country when they haven't done anything to us. So and this whole thing takes 13 days. This Cuban Missile Crisis is a 13-day chicken fight, like standoff between us and the Soviet Union, like who's going to back out first. And we start by saying, hey, we found out that you've got these things in Cuba. They got to go. Get rid of them. And Khrushchev responds by saying, hey, I appreciate that you're contacting me, but guess what? You have missiles in Turkey. Turkey borders Russia. At least you have some water between you and Cuba. I don't have anything between me and Turkey. So who are you to tell me that I need to remove my weapons from Cuba when you have weapons in Turkey? And we're like, oh, this is awkward. You bring up a valid point. And honestly, he totally does. But our response was, we did not place those weapons in Turkey. We actually gave those weapons to the United Nations, and the UN placed those weapons in Turkey. That's not our business. We sold them the weapons. Whatever they do with them, that's their business. I mean, we can't tell them to pull them out. That only the UN could pull out those missiles. And Khrushchev's like, well, then I'm sorry. I don't know what you want to do. I don't know what you want me to do, but I'm not pulling my missiles out of Cuba unless you pull your missiles out of Turkey. And while we're having this conversation, what we find out is that there are more ships on the way, Russian ships on the way to Cuba right then with more weapons on board. And what we don't want is to let those weapons reach Cuba. So instead of blockading Cuba to block them off, we instead decide to use something called a quarantine, which is probably a word that you're very sick of hearing. And you should all very much know what a quarantine is by now. But the plan is to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world. Now, is this essentially a blockade? Yes. But because we're giving it a different name, we can tell ourselves that we're not committing an act of war, and that way we can sleep better at night. We set up our quarantine/blockade. And the Soviets don't stop. They continue the ship right on the way. So then we're like, are we going to shoot the ship? Like, what are we going to, is that what we're going to do? Like, what do we do if the ship keeps coming? If we shoot the ship, then we've definitely committed an act of war. And Khrushchev shows no signs of stopping. So ultimately, Kennedy threatens to invade Cuba and to forcibly remove all of these, which the Soviet Union knows that would full on mean war. And clearly, Kennedy doesn't mind being the one responsible for it. So ultimately, Khrushchev backs down. Kennedy Kennedy backs down. No one invades Cuba. They don't send the weapons. And Khrushchev will disassemble the ones that had been already constructed there. So Kennedy got a lot of props for this. This was a very scary time, and all of this was public knowledge. Some of this was classified, but for the most part, the American people knew that we were potentially days away from a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. We knew that it was on the news that there was nuclear weapons in Cuba, and that the Kennedy administration was currently negotiating with Khrushchev to remove them. So this was definitely a very fearful time for a lot of people.